What do you predict the future of the social impact sector 10 years from now? What will we be focused on? What do you see as the galvanizing issue or focus mission of the social impact sector?
I think it's going to be broad and dynamic. Gen Z and millennials to some extent, they are being raised in a time where social justice and social impact is important to them.
You're listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast about all things talent management for social impact organizations. This episode is part of a special series with Lisa Brown Alexander, founder and CEO for Nonprofit HR. This special series focuses on all things organizational culture. Never miss an episode of The Switch. Visit us online at nonprofithr.com/The Switch. And now for some information about our conversation host. Driven to serve the often overlooked people management needs for the social impact sector, Lisa Brown Alexander set out to build a market where one didn't exist. She founded Nonprofit HR in 2000, the leading talent management firm in the country that works exclusively with the nonprofit sector. A serial entrepreneur, Lisa is also co-founder of Wellspring Manor and Spa, located in Prince George's County, Maryland. Lisa's goal is to ensure that every nonprofit HR engagement inspires social sector leaders to strengthen their most important asset, their people. Over the course of her career, Lisa has presented to hundreds of organizations, staff, and leadership teams, covering all things talent management for the social sector. Nonprofit HR has also been listed by Inc. 5000 as one of the nation's fastest growing companies. And now, here are some details about our guest. Marc Morial, one of the few national leaders to possess street smarts and boardroom savvy, is the transformative president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. He served as the highly successful and popular mayor of New Orleans, as well as the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Marc previously was a Louisiana state senator and a lawyer in New Orleans with a high-profile practice. He is the leading voice on the national stage in the battle for jobs, education, housing, health, voting rights, equity, and entrepreneurship. Marc is the host of the weekly syndicated television show America's Black Forum, a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in economics and African American studies. He has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine, one of the top 50 nonprofit leaders by the Nonprofit Times, and one of the 100 most influential Black lawyers in America. He has also been inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia. Marc and his father, the late Ernest Studge Morial, are history makers as the first African-American father-son mayors in the U.S., and they were the subject of a double Jeopardy question on the legendary Jeopardy television game show in the 1990s. And now, here's Lisa Brown Alexander and Marc Morial.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Marc. We are delighted to be in conversation with you to talk about all things leadership, nonprofit, talent. But let's first start by talking about your journey. You've had a rich and colorful journey. You're currently serving as the CEO of the National Urban League. But of course, we know that you were also the mayor of New Orleans, the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and a Louisiana state senator. So you've had a wide variety of leadership roles. Tell us about your journey out of government into the social sector. What drew you to that space?
So it's great to be with you, and thank you for the conversation. You know, this morning while cleaning up in my little home office, I found this doc. This is my resume from when I was out of law school, maybe about 3 years at the beginning of my journey to build a law firm. So prior to even becoming a public official, I practiced law roughly for 10 years. I had a very successful, energizing, and purposeful law practice before I even became an elected official. But, you know, I learned early, and this is probably the best way to respond, that what motivated me was purpose. And when I had purpose, I had passion. When I had passion, I could perform at my highest skill level. And that meant when I was practicing law, it was about building a firm that would give me a living and building a business that would make money. But it also meant working on projects, initiatives, and cases that had purpose to them. And that meant civil rights. It meant voting rights. It meant employment discrimination. Working on behalf of taxi cab drivers and street performers performers and Black construction firms who were trying to open doors and build businesses as well. My journey to purpose has everything to do with the wonderful, wonderful parents who raised me, my late father, my mother, who were community leaders and civil rights advocates. My mother was a second grade teacher. Later, she became a university administrator. She's a published author. My late dad was a pioneering lawyer and pioneering elected official, became the first Black legislator, first Black appeals court judge, first Black mayor of New Orleans. We grew up in a time of challenge and purpose. We kind of thought that's what you did. So you were raised that way without even realizing you were being raised that way. And that's been a motivating factor in how I've wanted to use whatever talent God has provided to me on behalf of others, on behalf of mission, on behalf of institution building.
You talk about your parents and the work that you did in civil rights. Was there a defining moment in your career where you knew you were kind of destined to be focused on purpose and mission and community building?
I think early in my career, I joined a law firm out of law school, thinking that was the pathway. Very few African-American lawyers in New Orleans. I had gone to Georgetown University Law School. I went back to New Orleans, joined a law firm, a major law firm. And at that time, in the mid-'80s, realized that even 20 years after the Civil Rights Act, very few major law firms in New Orleans had hired lawyers. I think when I started, there may have been less than 10, maybe 5 to 7 in the history of the city that had worked at one of the top, let's say 50 law firms in New Orleans. I joined a law firm and the work had some intellectual stimulation, commercial law, real estate and property law. It didn't energize me in the sense of motivating me to really believe that I could be a real difference maker. And then I got an opportunity while I was at the firm to argue before the Louisiana Supreme Court as a young lawyer. It was a case of purpose. It was a case involving the public record status of police reports in a criminal defense case. And I won that case. And it was a very material case that is utilized by every journalist and criminal law defense lawyer in Louisiana to this day. I realized when I did that, purpose was my calling. And I did something dramatic. I walked away from this law firm after only being there for less than 2 years and started my own practice. And I never looked back, never once regretted it, but value the time I spent in that environment, understanding, because a law firm, they were very good lawyers, very smart lawyers, very precise lawyers, knew how to run a business, understood how to handle cases. And I learned a tremendous amount in that 2-year period that, of course, I transferred to my own practice when I had that opportunity. And so purpose, I think it was a defining moment for me in my career. And then I got involved in a voting rights case challenging the district lines for the Louisiana Supreme Court, which had been racially gerrymandered. And I ended up being part of a team. I was a named plaintiff in that case that took that case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and we won and transformed the Louisiana judiciary, which is why Louisiana has the largest number of Black judges per capita anywhere in the country. So purpose, working for justice, was really my calling, and politics was about purpose. It was about making a difference. It was about being transformational. That's what motivated me. I was motivated by that generation for whom that was the reason they got into politics.
Versus the other way around.
Versus getting there because you love attention, you love power, or you have a generalized sense of service. Mine was a sense of public service, but a sense of being able to fight to level the playing field for economic and social justice, doing it as an elected policymaker after working on it as an activist and a lawyer.
That's fantastic. And that justice thread and this purpose thread seems to have woven itself through your career. If we fast forward to your role today as president of the National Urban League, what would you say most prepared you for what we're living with and grappling with today in America as it relates to civil rights, economic justice, fair housing?
The totality of my life's experiences. I was born in a segregated hospital. I was born in the waning days of segregation. My brothers and sisters and I always went to integrated schools. But when we began attending those schools, we were the first Black students at those schools. Whether it was my elementary school, my middle school, or high school I attended. So we understood racism, but we also understood human goodwill. And we understood, because of our parents, I think, and what they spent their life doing, this sort of obligation to work on behalf of the community. Our parents said, look, you're in these schools, but you're pioneering for others. You're not just there because of yourself or for yourself. And that was a good sense So I think the totality of life circumstances and watching, knowing Southern racism and the fact that after the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the changes in the South. Now I'm living in the South, I'm living in New Orleans, the deep South. While there was incredible hope and aspirations by Black people and many white, there was also resentment that the old system had changed. So you had this swirling conflict that was on the surface and underneath, all going on at the same time.
Sounds like 2024, doesn't it?
Exactly. We've seen this movie. This is not new. It may feel new, but it's an old American story of fear of a pluralistic, multicultural, multiracial democracy. And it is a battle for the future of the country. We have to understand it in that kind of context. So in that, it is a purposeful battle. And at the National Urban League, I get an opportunity to be on the front lines in this work. And it's work and it's a fight. And you're trying to build alliance and energize people and strategize about how to do this with the view that what we're talking about here is in the best interest of the nation.
Transfer this concept of justice into an organization. After the murder of George Floyd, many organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, waved a flag of justice and equity and inclusion and belonging that in many instances proved to not be true. As a CEO at the National Urban League, which is a world-renowned organization, primarily African-American workforce, how does justice show up inside your organization?
When justice is in your DNA, it's normal.
Let me ask you a harder question. How does it not show up in an organization sometimes when maybe you advocate for justice publicly, but internally there may still be some battles going on?
It manifests itself in workforce policies, practices. It manifests itself in hiring, in promotion, in who's in the room when major decisions are being made. It manifests itself in that fashion and in that way. It manifests itself in presumption, privilege. People don't even realize it. So for us, the George Floyd moment was not a wake up. It was a moment of acceleration and opportunity for us to get more support for what we work on every day, for us to double down on some of our work. And I asked repeatedly in public appearances and in speeches and in interviews at that time, tests would be whether George Floyd's awful murder was the beginning of a movement or was it a moment? And the verdict on that has not yet been revealed or released, but the weight of the evidence pushing because of this backlash that for many was a moment, not a movement. And the tension between moment and movement is being played out right now. We've seen the enabling of making it a moment in a string of decisions by the United States Supreme Court. We see it by this ugly movement in state legislatures. The banning of diversity, equity, and inclusion in law is a step towards resegregation of America, to step in that direction.
How do you fight that as CEO in your organization? Let's set the community aside for a moment and let's talk internally with the staff who you lead every day to do this important work. What do you see as your personal role as the CEO to ensure that you're maintaining an equitable and just workforce and work environment?
You have to show courage and lead by example. Lead by how you talk about things, what you talk about, how you lead. You cannot talk about diversity in a CEO and your leadership team is not diverse. And you're not making any moves. You make excuses. Well, I don't think anybody's ready, or we don't have the proper pipeline. I tell CEOs that picking your leadership team is like a head coach deciding who's on the starting team. I'm picking who I want to pick because I think they're good. I don't care if Joe's been here longer than Charlie. Charlie's better. I'm putting Charlie on the team. Charlie's my starting quarterback. Joe, I like you, but just because you've been here the longest doesn't entitle you. You have to lead by example, and you have to be intentional about leading by example. And you have to realize sometimes when you pursue a more diverse workforce, some people aren't going to like it. And sometimes you got to say, well, walk with me, go down this journey with me, get with it, or get out. Leaders set tone. Diversity is not a preference. We have 50 years, 60 years now of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We have 60 years of whether you call it affirmative action. You look at the generation of us that got into elite schools, got into corporate jobs because affirmative action opened the door. And you're going to see superstars, overachievers, great performers. That's the evidence that diversity is good for America. The success of those that walk through the door. Civil rights opened the door for women. people of color who now are in leadership positions, significant, not enough, throughout American life. Government, private sector, nonprofit sector, university presidents, university deans, CEOs of nonprofits, members of Congress, mayors of big cities, you name it. And that's really the point, to look at the pragmatics here. Are we a better nation? And so leaders have to lead with conviction. And I think leaders have to go through an exercise. What is America going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? How is my organization best going to be positioned?
What do you predict the future of the social impact sector 10 years from now? What will we be focused on? What do you see as the galvanizing issue or focus mission of the social impact sector?
So I think it's going to be broad and dynamic. And I think it's broad and dynamic because I think Gen Z and millennials to some extent are being raised in a time where the Great Recession, the election of Obama, the rise of Trump, the COVID recession, international conflict, they are being raised in a time where social justice and social impact is important to them.
Absolutely.
You're not going to deny that in any way. That to me is a movement. So the social justice, social impact, NGO, civil society sector is going to be as important in the future as ever before. And it will continue to be important on a range of issues. Fundamental to it is to push the nation towards the goal of becoming a more perfect union. Push the nation to a nation where its founding principles of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, are meaningful and actual. I think the social, civil society, social justice, social impact sector, that's what it's about. It's going to be crucially important, very impactful in so many ways. And I think the other thing about the future is, how much is the future also going to include global? We are thinking about expansions into Canada, the UK, West Africa, whether there's more global alliances amongst civil society, social and economic justice organizations. You know, it's interesting. W.B. Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, met in 1945 at an international Pan-African conference.
Pan-Africanism as a Jamaican descendant.
Okay, so you know
grew up hearing about Marcus Garvey, so yeah.
Right, so you know, Garvey and Nkrumah and Du Bois sort of aligned through these international convening that brought them together. And I think it's fascinating. Where's the Davos for the civil society sector or the NGO sector? I think in this country, there's also got to be greater focus in the civil society sector, understanding the role of leadership by Black people, Latinos, Asians, and women as well, right? So there was an issue that came up about an organization some time ago, and they served poor people with a big emphasis on the Black community. When you looked at their board, they had not one Black person on the board. When you looked at their executive team, there were no Black people on their executive team.
Why do you think that is, Mark? Why do you
I think people have subconscious racism. They sometimes think the most important thing is for us to care, and that is fundamentally important. Also, you have to practice what you preach. That's the most important element of this. You got to practice what you preach. And so the NGO sector, civil society sector, is also a place where you build community leadership.
Absolutely.
And you build community responsibility, and you build people's ability to work better their own communities through not just people doing for, but saying, come in, be a part of this, which is why it is so important. I was in a discussion and people were talking about young people in democracy. I said, look at this group. We don't have anybody under 35 in it. Think maybe we should bring some under 35s in here and let them engage and ask them what they think, and not just imagining what people think. We're reading papers and studies and talking to people anecdotally. Sometimes in this work, you got to check yourself, recheck. And when you're in leadership, you got to check, are we approaching this the right way? Are we listening to the right people? Leadership is not easy.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you check yourself as a leader in a social impact organization where you're drinking your own Kool-Aid every day, right? You're out there advocating, promoting, talking about community. But as a leader, particularly the last 4 years for social impact leaders has been challenging. As the social impact sector has picked up where government has not been able to, or where for the for-profit sector just hasn't had the wherewithal. And so as a leader, how do you look at yourself and check yourself as a leader to make sure you keep your feet on the ground?
For me personally, I try to pay attention to emerging social and cultural trends. I have an 18 and a 21-year-old.
Well, that will do it. That'll help.
It's a combination of things inside of an organization. I did something, and in fact, it reminds me I got to renew it. I put together an informal employee advisory council. I deliberately chose people from the middle to the bottom of the organization, which meant it skewed a lot younger. And I invited them in for some discussion about workplace and other issues. And the ground rules were that there was nobody else, no HR, no lawyer, no supervisors in the room, just me and them.
Mm.
And the ground rules were that I could report out what was said, but not who said it.
There you go.
Trying
What
to
have
be
you learned? What have you learned?
Well, we modified our employee evaluation system based on some things we heard. We did some team building and professional development that were a little bit different. Didn't hear a whole lot in terms of how we positioned ourselves. And in some things, some recommendations, I had to forcefully push back and tell them why we do certain things, because they didn't have the history of how some things have evolved because of error, mistake, and things like that, right? That's one way. There are a multiplicity of ways. To hear, we have an executive cabinet meeting that takes place twice a month, roughly. It's the top 10 to 12 people in the organization. We meet all the time. We don't just meet as needed. We always have an agenda, and we have open discussion on things.
Tell us about the composition of your executive team. And do you think you are further ahead, on pace with, or lagging behind what you see the composition of other executive teams look like across the social?
We have a predominantly Black workforce.
Okay.
Probably about 65, 70%. The other 30, 35 are made up of whites, Latinos, and Asian. We have a mixture of the non-African American. We also have a majority female workforce, 70%. The leadership probably half and half,
Okay.
male, female.
Male or female, okay.
So to some extent, we're way ahead of most organizations, right? For us, it's important for people to be mission aligned.
Mm-hmm.
You can't work for McDonald's if you hate hamburgers. You hate fast food. So you can't come work for us and say, well, I'm not down with civil rights. I'm not down with racial justice. I don't think it's a problem. No, this is not the place for you.
Right.
In a mission organization, you have to be mission aligned, skills, but also be mission aligned.
Yeah.
Over the period of time, it's been a journey to creating a much more professional workspace.
Mhm.
And then we have, in addition to my immediate 100 or so employees plus who work for the National Urban League, we have 2,500 employees that work for our affiliates around the nation. While they're not our employees, but we set tone and mission, maybe not necessarily on HR policies, but on public policies and program policies in the NGO space. I'd like to think we're head of class. We have an operations scorecard with about 100 metrics.
That included talent factor?
Yeah, it's got a range of metrics. We have metrics around our programs, around our finances, around our talent, around our events. We have been doing this now for almost 15 years, right? So we put the scorecard in front of the board in the fall, and the score is, it's in effect an operations plan. They approve it, and then we're evaluated on it at the end of the year.
Ask you a question about your colleagues, CEOs across the NGO and social impact space who may come to you as the CEO of the Urban League to say, Mark, I'm struggling in my trade association to diversify my workforce or to show up as an inclusive, equitable organization. What's your best advice to sector leaders who may not be as equitable or diverse or as inclusive as the Urban League? They're at the beginning of their journey. What advice?
You have to articulate and communicate why it's important. So it's important, number one, I can't get the best talent if I only recruit south of the river. I've got to recruit north of the river and south of the river and east of the river and west to get the best talent. Number two, our workforce and leadership team needs to match the nation and the communities we serve. Number three, we have a fundamental commitment to fairness and equity. Why is this important? Why? You got to articulate. Sometimes people don't understand it, or their head has been filled with negativity. Why are we even doing this? Why do we need to do this? And then there are practical considerations. Our funders, our board, the people we recruit, they ask us about this.
Absolutely.
Now, that's number one. Number two, you need a plan to do it and realize you're not going to do it overnight. And it's not accomplished by symbolic hiring here or there. But sometimes making a fast move is important because it shows people you're serious. How do you hire? I keep a tight rein on our hiring. Above a certain level, I'm involved in the interview.
Say why? What's your why?
Because 3 heads is better than 1. Because I have experience hiring. I have some people who have the task to hire. They don't have a lot of experience hiring. Maybe they have 3 or 4 people in their life. I've hired hundreds. So we always have interview team. We've begun using some leadership assessment tests for certain level of hiring. You never get it right all the time. You just don't want to make a lot of mistakes. And I think it takes a lot of work to hire. We're trying to do a better job onboarding and developing, right? Nonprofits have tight money. They can't do things big corporations can do. So you have to have a plan to do it. You have to think, okay, what does my plan look like? How am I going to think about my hiring, think about my promoting, think about my developing? And then I am also, this is a common thing that happens. There's the workplace, and then there's after work.
Forrest.
And then you see people who create these, what I call water cooler coalition. And if you're not in the water cooler coalition, they're making decisions and talking about things and coming into work.
Right.
I can't stop the water cooler coalition.
Mm-hmm.
I got to know about it. I always got to have my ear to the ground.
Absolutely.
Something came up last week, and someone said, my goodness, how do you even know any of this? I said, because I just listen. I don't talk. If somebody wants to talk to me, if somebody gives me information, sometimes I'm like, I don't say anything. But you got to kind of also know what's going on. A leader can become isolated at the top.
The role of leadership in culture and shaping the culture of your organization. So many of the organizations that we work with are focused on mission and amazing, important mission work. But when we look inward, sometimes we see something very different than what's advocated for publicly. And so talk to me about what you see as the primary role of a CEO as a leader in shaping the culture of their organization. What is allowed, what is tolerated, what's celebrated, what's practiced.
After COVID, and now that we're on a 3-2 split, all my employees have to sign in.
Say more about that.
And I got challenged on it. And I said, well, the reason why everybody's got to sign in is because I had a handful of people ghosting.
Okay.
So I'm not running around trying to catch the ghost. I'm going to stop the ghost, period, right? I sign in. I'm not going to tell you sign in and I don't sign in.
And you mentioned lead by example, so that's good.
You got to have systems and got to have verification. So there's some workplace rules we have. It's a trade-off. I'm trying to pick
the trade-off.
The trade-off is, for example, last year, we're on a 3-2 split. I'll say like the week of Thanksgiving, everybody can work from home this week. We close between Christmas and New Year's. Mm-hmm. If the 4th of July weekend looks like, I might say work from home. We're going to do things. It's a little bit of a trade-off. There's going to be sweeteners. And so I just balance off things. I'm progressive and old school. I believe in accountability, obligation to donors. That money's going to be used and people are going to come here and they're going to work and they're going to give it their best. And that's what they're going to do. And I always say, if you need a different kind of job, it may not be here.
That's fair. What do you see the role of trust and empathy in the workplace?
I think trust and empathy is important, but I think trust and verification is important too. And I think accountability, I don't think these things operate separately.
This is a trust
organization. This is not my personal relationship. This is not my family. This is a professional environment. Trust, empathy, accountability, responsibility. Okay. It's a complete package. You are an adult. This is not high school. When you're in college, no one cares if you come to class. They don't care. And guess what? You could be successful never going to class if you can write papers and ace tests. You cannot be successful in most workplaces with that approach.
And therefore,
this is different.
Okay.
This is not an extension of that.
And so, Marc, how do you grapple with the generational perceptions of workplace trust, the role of empathy in leadership? How do you grapple with that? You mentioned that you've got kind of a broad spectrum. 70% of your staff are female. You've got young, you've got more mature. How do generational differences show up?
You have to also be flexible. Like I tell people, sometimes people say I have a family situation. Take care of your family situation. You got to be flexible sometimes. Things come up with people's kids, their parents, their significant others. And you got to have a degree of flexibility, but that's where you trust, right? I trust you if you say, hey, my mom, I got to get her to the doctor today. It's going to take all day. Okay, no problem. I'm going to be in late. I trust you. You built up trust. You have to be personally empathetic. You have to understand people, and people have families, they have children, they have things. So it's a tug and a go. We were working from home. I brought people back 2 days a week, then 3 days a week. Monday, work from home. Friday, work from home. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I expect you to be in the office, unless you're traveling. A lot of people travel for work. You just have to be accountable for where you are, what you're doing.
Where do you think the future of hybrid work is going to go, given that a lot of organizations are back in the workplace physically coming in, but they're allowing a measure of flexibility.
I think your work from home is going to be an exception rather than the rule. Because I think what people are finding out is number one, you can't build collaborative cultures if everybody's working
Putting
from home.
together.
Teamwork does make the dream work. And teamwork, like I tell people, the way we at the National Urban League punch above our weight is through teamwork and collaboration. That's how people think, oh, you want to have 500 employees. We punch above our weight because we're great collaborators. We work together. We have these teams. That's what we do. We're really, really good at that. It took me a while to build that kind of culture. But that's the kind of culture I built in the city of New Orleans as well, right? Collaborations inside and outside of government, working on projects and tasks, getting people involved in designing and in executing, sort of like my philosophy of transformational leadership. You got to get people get the buy-in. Certain types of work, hybrid does work, but I do think it's important that people get a chance to check in. I do think that's important, and I think it's going to be a combination. You could end up with a 4-day work week.
There's some legislation underfoot.
It depends. So if you have a company, let's say that's a retail, and the executives say we're going to work 4 days a week, but the line employees got to work 5. Got to be careful in how you think about this. So maybe an accounting firm, maybe certain law firms, maybe certain knowledge-based businesses could work 4-day work week, potentially, right? And sometimes with hybrid work, the day you're working at home is a day where you balance personal and work. It's going to be interesting to look at this in connection with the AI revolution. And that is, how productive can people be actually working fewer hours?
Talk about AI as we wrap up our conversation today. I'm curious how AI intersects with the work of justice and the work the National Urban League is advocating for. How do you see AI playing into your work?
So this is like a ledger. Good, bad.
Okay, say more.
So good on AI is it can make people more productive. It can allow certain things to happen much more quickly, more efficiently, more uniformly. I was in a conversation and I said, does anybody know what a line is? A clothesline.
We're like, what? What is that?
A clothesline. I see them before you had a
Defend
dryer.
yourself, Mark.
My grandmother and my mother before we had a dryer.
That's right. I remember those days.
Put their clothes outside, dry all the clothes, right? Dry the sheets, dry the towels, dry the clothes.
Bring them in and iron them.
Yeah. And I said, a clothesline. I said, a machine called a dryer made things easy. Right. What about when I was growing up, the house we first lived in had no dishwasher. Mm-hmm. So you had dishwashing duty.
That's right. That's right.
Now you have load them in the dishwasher. There's substantial benefits. But on the other hand, there's great options for abuse with doctored photos and artificial videos and intrusions. The possibility that AI can take away jobs and then it may create new jobs, but the jobs it creates, the people whose jobs it's taking away don't have the skills to do it. This is a balance, and the justice issues around the abuse and the potential for profiling and lots of the things are of great concern, while on the other hand, the broader issues of productivity. Think of the world without the washer, the dryer, and the dishwasher. Just think about the world without those things. Go back even further.
In and of itself is not a bad thing. It's how it gets used.
And the issue is we have allowed the technology industry to morph very little rules and regulations. Think about dishwashers and dryers. There are a set of rules and regulations around consumer product safety that they're subjected to, whereas social media and technology said, don't regulate it, you're gonna hurt it. Well, that was to me an overreaction. And now it's hard to put parameters and rules and the broken politics of America and the inability to achieve consensus. We're gonna see this played out potentially in the election upcoming in terms of how AI could be used and how AI could be abused.
Yes.
I urge people to not get in this bandwagon of, oh, it's horrible.
Right.
On this bandwagon is the greatest thing that's ever happened.
Take a more balanced approach.
Yeah, and really debate it. So we're trying, NUL, we've been involved on the justice and the policy side of technology and AI. Now we're trying to get a sense of how it might be able to help us operationally. Mm-hmm. So we got a balance too. There was a point where we as an organization published 2 magazines and 7 newsletters. I made a decision in 2008 to ditch them all and move to electronic communication. The people who ran those magazines magazines are still mad. They didn't see the future. They thought, oh, put more money into the magazine. Magazines were dying. They're very expensive. They were hard to get distribution on. I said, let's change to a technology-focused communication style. You could hold on to yesterday too long and be out of business. At the National Urban League, before I got there in the late 90s, there was a raging debate over whether they should move to utilization of computers.
Wow.
Because people said, we got our selectric typewriters. This is something for leaders, right? Think, decide, also balance. One of the important things for leaders, you have to self-educate. The power of the computer is I can look things up myself, sometimes with great ease.
Not always great accuracy, but great.
And you have to always use the old saying, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Be skeptical of what you read. Check the source. Don't believe it because it's on the internet. The point is a leader has to self-educate. And you self-educate some ways by reading, some by just talking to other people.
Absolutely.
And we as people in sort of civil society, nonprofit, like we in the civil rights community, a lot of us trade notes. We trade notes on issues. Because I ran a much, much larger organization, a city, a very complex organization before I came to the NGO sector. I had a foundational basis, but to learn some things about the NGO sector, some idiosyncrasies and realities that may be significantly different than government.
We certainly appreciate having learned from you today, and I do hope that our audience has gleaned some knowledge from you, some insights. As we wrap up and we think about the future, I guess I wonder in these last moments what you might share with other sector leaders about how to run a successful organization, how to have impact. What words of inspiration might you share with nonprofit leaders listening in today?
Pay attention to your physical and mental health.
We should have started with that.
Very important, and everybody does it in a different way. I'm a fitness person. It's really important to me. I pay attention to some basic things, working out, how I eat, my sleep, things. I pay attention to basic things. Whatever you do, pay attention to your physical and mental health. Very important to do that because you can get run down, worn out, irritable. Lots of things can happen because of the stress and the pressure. And make time for the people who are important to you. And understand 360 communication. You got to communicate with your board. You got to communicate with your employees. You got to communicate with your donors. You got to communicate with your stakeholders and constituents that you serve. Execute them. Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the early 1800s. One of the things that fascinated me the most was the existence of the voluntary sector, civil society, nonprofit, and their power and how they're so unique. A unique component of America is the dynamism of civil society. Understand that and embrace that. Your ability, your power to be a change agent and an influencer. I want to just do one thing. I got a leadership book. It's called The Gumbo Coalition. For those of you that want a good, easy read, check it out. And there's also a documentary, also called The Gumbo Coalition on HBO Max.
Well, congratulations on that front.
Janet Murguia and I, who runs Unidos US, just want to make a little plug.
Perfect way to end. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, please.
Take good care.
God bless. Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode. Special thank you to our host, Lisa Brown Alexander, founder and CEO for Nonprofit HR. And very special thank you to our guest as well, Marc Morial, President and CEO for National Urban League. Learn more about Nonprofit HR online. Visit us at nonprofithr.com and learn more about National Urban League as well. Visit them at nul.org.